I remember the night before it all went wrong. I didn't realize it then, but something about it felt off. I'd been planning this road trip for months. Just me, my old Jeep, and the open highway. No destination in mind, just the freedom of the road stretching ahead. My buddy Mark was supposed to come with me, but at the last minute he bailed. Something about work, I think. It wasn't a big deal. I'm used to flying solo. I'd loaded up the Jeep, checked the gas, and said goodbye to my apartment. I was headed to the Nevada desert to explore some ghost towns that had piqued my interest. Nothing too out of the ordinary. The whole thing was supposed to be a carefree adventure. I drove through the night, the highway lights flickering behind me as I cruised through the vast emptiness of California. I wasn't tired. I was pumped, excited about the unknown. The music in my car was set to some old rock playlist, the kind that makes the miles fly by. By the time I hit the outskirts of Nevada, it was 2 a.m. The air felt different here, thicker somehow. There's a certain kind of eerie quiet when you're deep in the desert, away from civilization. The only sound was the hum of my Jeep's engine and the occasional rustle of wind across the barren landscape. I pulled into a small gas station in the middle of nowhere to top off the tank, figuring I wouldn't get another chance for miles. It was there that I first saw him. He was standing outside the small store, a man in his early 50s, grizzled and wearing a weathered leather jacket. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but his eyes, they were too bright, too intense, like he was staring right through me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me as I pumped gas. I tried to ignore it. I'd seen my fair share of weird people on the road, especially out here. But then, as I was finishing up, he spoke. "You're not supposed to go that way," he said. His voice raspy like he hadn't spoken in days. I froze. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "There's nothing out there but bad luck. You shouldn't be alone." Something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't scared, yet, but there was definitely something unsettling about the way he said it. It was like a warning, but not the kind that was meant to help. "I'm fine," I said, trying to brush it off, paying for my gas quickly. "Just passing through." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his eyes never blinking. I felt like I was under some kind of spell, but before I could think about it too much, I quickly got in my Jeep, slammed the door, and drove off without another word. I didn't think about him much after that. I was too focused on the road ahead, my mind racing with excitement. But that man's words kept echoing in my head, like a warning bell I couldn't shake off. What was it he had said again? Bad luck. I'd soon find out how true that was. The next few hours passed in a blur of empty roads and endless desert. The Jeep's headlights cut through the darkness, and the only sign of life was the occasional coyote sprinting across the highway. I tried to brush off the strange encounter at the gas station, but the man's warning lingered, like a bad taste in my mouth. I wasn't superstitious, and I wasn't about to let some random guy ruin my trip. I turned off the main highway, heading deeper into the desert, toward a series of old ghost towns I'd read about. The kind of places where time stood still, and the only thing left were the decaying buildings and the stories of those who once lived there. As I drove further away from civilization, the landscape grew more desolate. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, like something was watching. I couldn't explain it, but I started feeling an odd sense of unease. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of an old town, Redstone, as the faded sign at the town's entrance read, that I realized how far off the beaten path I'd truly gone. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The buildings were in ruins, their windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. I had expected something eerie, but this was something else entirely. It felt like a ghost town in the truest sense. I parked the Jeep at the edge of the town and grabbed my camera. I wasn't expecting much, just some creepy photos to show off when I got back. But as I stepped out of the Jeep, I felt it, the sudden, overwhelming sense that I was not alone. It was as if the desert itself had swallowed me up and was waiting for me to make a mistake. The air was heavy, thick with dust and silence. Too quiet. Not even a bird dared to make a sound. I started walking down the main street of Redstone, taking pictures of the crumbling buildings, trying to ignore the way my heart was racing in my chest. There was something about this place, something that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the oppressive silence, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, as if they were moving. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise. It wasn't the sound of wind or animals. It was footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the alleyway to my left. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it might be another tourist or someone else who had wandered into the town, but then I realized how stupid that sounded. Who else would be here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? I turned to look, but the alleyway was empty. I shook it off. It was just the wind, I told myself. Nothing more. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. But this time, it wasn't alone. I could hear something else now, a low, guttural growl, almost like an animal in pain. My instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. My body was telling me to leave, but my legs were frozen, unwilling to move. I took a step back toward the Jeep, trying to force my mind to stay rational. But the growl grew louder, and then, through the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow darting across the street. A figure too tall and too thin to be human, moving in jerky, unnatural movements. I didn't wait for it to get closer. I bolted for the Jeep, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the door, I looked back once, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the alley, watching me. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing into the darkness of the town like a wisp of smoke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking, waiting for me to make a mistake. I slammed the door of the Jeep shut and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I put it in reverse, my foot heavy on the pedal. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The road ahead was my only focus now. But as I drove away from Redstone, the thought lingered in my mind. Was it just my imagination? Or was something really watching me? Something that had been waiting for someone like me to come into its world. I'd find out soon enough. I didn't stop driving after leaving Redstone. The town, with its crumbling buildings and the twisted figure in the shadows, felt like it was branded into my mind. I tried to rationalize everything. The growl, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The further I drove into the night, the more the sense of unease gnawed at me, like an invisible presence riding beside me. The empty highway stretched ahead, the headlights illuminating the road but offering no comfort in the dark, oppressive landscape around me. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure from the alleyway following me. But the mirror was always empty. Around 4 a.m., I decided to stop at another gas station. I figured I could use a break, stretch my legs, and get some coffee to stay alert. The place was run down just like the others, but there was something about it that felt different, darker almost. The flickering lights above the pumps buzzed erratically, and the place had an abandoned feel to it, even though the pumps were in working order. I got out of the Jeep, locking the door behind me, and walked to the front of the station. There was a small convenience store inside, its windows cracked and dirty. I could barely see inside, but I thought I caught the silhouette of a person moving in the shadows. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in. The air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sickly yellow shadows across the shelves. But what really stood out was the man behind the counter. He was sitting with his back to me, hunched over, staring at the wall. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. Something about him seemed off. It was like he knew I was there before I even walked in. I tried to shake it off and approached the counter. "Hey man, got any coffee?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the silence. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his head slowly, like it was a chore, and looked at me. His eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, too wide for someone who had just woken up. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with that vacant, glassy look. Then finally he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice rasped, like it hadn't been used in years. "They know you're coming." I froze, unable to speak for a moment. The words felt like a punch to the gut. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the sweat beginning to bead on the back of my neck. I opened my mouth to say something, but the man's gaze never left me. "They've been watching you," he continued. "They're already here. It's too late." I tried to force a laugh, but it came out hollow. Too late for what? But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the wall, as if I wasn't even there anymore. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like it was closing in on me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place, that it was more than just an empty gas station. Something watched me. I turned to leave, but before I could even reach the door, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, coming from behind me. I spun around, but the man was still sitting there, motionless, facing the wall. No one else was in the store. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, so I rushed to the door, barely glancing back. As I stepped outside, I felt the temperature drop, a chill running down my spine. The night air felt colder, almost biting. I didn't look back as I got into the Jeep and slammed the door shut. I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I put the Jeep into drive and sped away from the gas station, the eerie silence of the desert surrounding me once again. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. That presence, that sense of being watched, was more intense than ever. And it wasn't until I glanced at the rearview mirror again that I saw it. For the briefest moment, I saw a shadow move across the road behind me. It was there, just behind the Jeep, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to make my blood run cold. The figure I had seen earlier in Redstone, was it following me? I stepped on the gas, not daring to look back again. But deep down, I knew whatever was out there wasn't going to let me leave easily. The road was no longer a path to freedom. It had become a trap, and I was caught. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow behind me. My pulse was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out of there. The desert stretched on endlessly, dark and desolate, but I kept pushing the Jeep forward. The hum of the engine and the low whine of the tires on the cracked asphalt were the only sounds that filled the air. Everything else felt off. It was then that I realized the shadow had stayed with me longer than I'd thought. I hadn't checked the rearview mirror in a while, but now, when I dared to glance back, I couldn't see anything in the reflection. Nothing. Just the empty road behind me. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but the relief was short-lived. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again, and a strange weight settled in my chest. Something was still there, watching, following. The road ahead was starting to feel like it was closing in on me. The darkness felt alive, like the night itself was pressing against my skin, suffocating me. I needed to get out of there, but every instinct told me that the farther I drove, the worse things would get. The GPS was useless, kept blinking, showing no signal, no reception, nothing. I took an exit onto a smaller road, hoping to find some sign of civilization. The dust kicked up behind me, swirling in the headlights, making it harder to see. The winding road twisted through more barren land, the kind that felt endless. As I drove, the sense of dread deepened. The silence in the air was palpable, heavy, like a pressure in my chest. Then I saw it, the figure on the side of the road. A man, standing completely still, facing me as I drove closer. His clothes were torn, his hair wild, like he had been out there for days, maybe longer. His hands hung by his sides, limp and lifeless, and his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he was observing me, waiting for something. I slowed down instinctively. I had no reason to stop, but I couldn't help it. There was something about the way he stood there that compelled me to slow my pace. When I reached him, I was close enough to see his face. His eyes were wide open, too wide, and they glistened in the headlights. They were full of fear, but not just fear, something else. The expression was frozen, stuck somewhere between panic and resignation, as if he knew what was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was impossible to look away. But then, Just as I was about to speed past him, something happened. The man's lips moved, almost imperceptibly, and I swear I heard him say my name. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away without thinking. My heart was pounding in my chest, my eyes wide with terror. I didn't even look back. Couldn't. The road stretched on, the eerie stillness following me like a shadow. My mind raced with thoughts. What was that man? Was he real? Was he part of whatever was haunting me out here? But then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I saw something that nearly made me crash. The man wasn't alone. Behind him, standing in the darkness, were more figures. Too many to count. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could see their movements, their unnatural stillness. They were all standing in the exact same position, their eyes fixed on me. I couldn't tell if they were human or something else entirely, but the sheer number of them, standing there in the dark, their presence suffocating, made my blood run cold. I couldn't drive fast enough. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every fiber of my being screamed to get away, but there was nowhere to go. No safe place. The headlights caught another figure. Another person standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were more. The road was filled with them, standing in place, like statues, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of fear and agony. I swerved to avoid one, but then another appeared. And another. It was like they were coming out of the very darkness itself, manifesting in the shadows. The Jeep's tires screeched as I swerved again, my heart racing. I could hear my breath, fast and shallow, my heart hammering in my chest as I floored the gas pedal. But no matter how fast I went, it felt like I was driving straight into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Then, as I glanced back one last time, I saw something that made me want to scream. One of the figures, an older man, was no longer standing still. He was moving, coming toward me at an unnatural speed, his arms outstretched like he was reaching for me. His face was twisted in a horrifying expression, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth open as if he was calling my name. I couldn't stop, couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The road was empty again, the only sound the harsh thumping of my heart in my chest. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare slow down. I just kept driving, the endless desert stretching out in front of me. I don't know how much time passed after I left the figures behind me. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours, but it felt like an eternity. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart still racing as the Jeep bounced over the uneven road. I kept my eyes straight ahead, terrified that if I dared glance into the rearview mirror, I'd see those same figures once more, those twisted, motionless shapes standing in the dark, waiting for me to make the mistake of looking back. But the desert was still, more still than it had ever been, the road empty, as if everything had gone silent just to trap me in this nightmare. My mind was spiraling. It was impossible to make sense of anything, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was following me. Something had been following me from the moment I left Redstone. It had been in the shadows, lurking, and now it felt like it had finally cornered me. The GPS still wasn't working, the screen blank and useless. No signal, no help. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was almost out of the worst of it, that I just had to keep going, keep driving, and I would eventually hit civilization. I had to believe that. If I didn't, I might lose my grip on reality altogether. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance. A light, a small speck of brightness in the pitch black of the desert. I thought maybe it was a mirage, but then it grew larger. It wasn't a star or a passing plane. No, it was a car's headlights, cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. Couldn't believe it. A sign of life, a sign of safety. I sped up, the hope flooding me in waves. Maybe it was another traveler, maybe it was someone who could help me. I couldn't think of anything else but the sight of that light. I pushed the Jeep harder, desperate to reach it, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling that something was still trailing me. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of a car parked on the side of the road. It was a rusted sedan, barely visible against the black backdrop of the desert. The headlights were on, but no one was in the driver's seat. I slammed on the brakes as I approached, my tires skidding across the gravel as I stopped just behind the vehicle. I got out, cautiously, unsure what I would find. The air was thick with tension, and every step I took felt like I was being watched. The desert around me was silent. No animals, no wind, just stillness. I approached the sedan, and that's when I saw the door open slightly. Not all the way, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something inside. A figure. I stepped closer, my breath coming in short bursts. The figure didn't move, just sat there, slumped against the seat. I had no idea who it was, but I knew I couldn't leave them there, alone in the middle of nowhere. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they were stranded like me. I took a deep breath and leaned in closer. That's when I saw it. The figure wasn't a person at all. It was a mannequin, a lifeless, plastic figure propped up in the driver's seat, its head lolling to one side. It was dressed in old clothes, its face painted with an eerie, frozen smile. But the worst part wasn't the mannequin itself. It was the note that had been shoved into the space between the mannequin's hands. I took it, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the yellowing paper. "They're still coming for you." I could feel my stomach twist, a wave of nausea crashing over me. I was about to back away when the lights of the sedan flickered, and then slowly they went out. I froze. A low, mechanical hum began to vibrate through the ground, like something underground was shifting, waking up. I turned around in a panic, my heart pounding louder than ever. The road was still empty, but something had changed. The stillness was gone. The air felt thick, charged, alive. And then I heard it, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with every passing second. Footsteps, slowly, deliberately, dragging across the desert. I didn't dare look behind me. I ran back to the Jeep, my mind racing, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. My hands shook so violently I almost couldn't start the engine. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what was happening. I just had to get away. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped off, my eyes glued to the road ahead. The hum from behind me grew louder, and I could feel the pressure in the air building with every second. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until it had me. I kept driving, faster and faster, until the desert swallowed me whole, and I couldn't tell whether I was still alive or just running from the nightmare that was chasing me. The Jeep roared over the rough desert road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The headlights sliced through the darkness, but the oppressive blackness seemed to stretch forever ahead. My mind was spiraling out of control. I couldn't escape this, whatever this was. It had followed me, hunted me, and now, I knew without a doubt, it was closing in on me. The hum behind me had intensified into a low, vibrating growl, almost like the earth itself was moaning, responding to whatever force was hunting me. I could feel the vibration in the seat beneath me, in the steering wheel, in my bones. Every part of me screamed to stop, to pull over, to just get out of the Jeep and let whatever this was take me. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I kept my foot pressed to the gas, heart pounding in my chest, as if I could outrun the horror that was closing in. Then the road began to change. The flat desert stretched on endlessly, but now it felt like it was winding, twisting in ways it hadn't before. The headlights caught something ahead, a shape, a figure, standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the Jeep skidded to a halt. For a moment, I thought I was going to crash, but somehow, I managed to stop just inches from the figure. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at it. It wasn't a person. It was a roadblock, a massive, ancient-looking structure that had appeared out of nowhere, standing like a sentinel in the middle of the road. The jagged stones towered over me, their sharp edges cutting into the night sky. The structure was crumbling, old, but there was something about it that felt alive, something watching me from within. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then, without warning, the structure shifted. Slowly, As though waking from a long slumber, the stones began to move. I could hear the grinding of stone on stone, like bones shifting beneath the weight of the earth. The air around me thickened, suffocating, and I saw someone, emerging from the shadowed crack in the middle of the roadblock. It was the figure from earlier, the one with the wide, glassy eyes, the one I had seen on the side of the road. Only now his face was different. His eyes were no longer wide in fear. They were empty, hollow, as if whatever had once been human in him had been erased completely. He began walking toward the jeep, his movements jerky, unnatural. I could see the other figures now, emerging from behind the roadblock. They were all around me, too many to count. They came in a slow, unrelenting wave, like ghosts or shadows brought to life. I could feel my heart in my throat as panic began to seize me. The growl that had been chasing me grew louder, vibrating through my chest. The road behind me was gone, the night pressing in from every side. There was nowhere to go, no escape. I slammed the gearshift into reverse and floored the pedal, but the Jeep didn't move. The engine sputtered and stalled. I tried again, but nothing happened. I was stuck. The figure was almost upon me now, his eyes wide and unblinking. He reached out a hand, his fingers twisted and malformed, and I could feel the cold air around him, deathly cold, like something ancient and unforgiving. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. But then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The growl vanished. The hum of the desert went silent. The figure froze halfway to the Jeep, and the other figures behind him stopped moving as well, becoming statues once more. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. There was no sound, no movement, just the stillness of the night. I opened my eyes, not sure what I expected to see. The figure in front of me was gone, vanished into the dark. The roadblock was still there, looming ominously, but the figures were no longer walking toward me. It was as if time had stopped. The air was still thick with dread, but nothing moved, not even the wind. I didn't dare to wait around to see what would happen next. I turned the key in the ignition once more, and this time, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove. I drove faster than I had ever driven before, not stopping, not thinking about anything except putting as much distance between me and that roadblock as possible. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw it. The faint glow of city lights in the distance. The first sign of civilization I had seen since all of this had begun. I didn't know where I was anymore, but it didn't matter. I was out of the desert. I was free, or so I thought. As I reached the edge of town, I saw a sign, a small, rusted metal placard by the side of the road. Redstone, the town I thought I had left behind. The place that had haunted me, that had almost claimed me. I froze. My blood ran cold. And in the rearview mirror I saw something else. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. And this time I wasn't sure if it was real, or if it was just the beginning of something much worse.